Alright, so we've all seen Novak playing with a black version of the Speed for a while now. Admittedly, for the Australian Open, it was still the black paint job of the previous one, but now it's official, he has switched to the brand new Speed Legend Pro. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. Now put the pitchforks down. I know Novak isn't actually switching frames, and whatever he's using, it's obviously just a new paint job, but Head has finally decided to give Novak his own dedicated line. That's what the Speed Legend is. To be honest, it's about time. Wilson did it 10 years ago with the RF97, and Babolat finally did it last year with the Origin. And I have to say, when I first heard rumors of this new Speed Legend, I was pretty excited. Novak's actual racket has been much discussed over the years, and while I haven't actually gotten to play with one, I know it's some sort of heavily customized liquid metal radical with an 18-19 string pattern and probably some other stuff as well. And when I say heavily modified, I'm not kidding. Now I'm going off of 2019 specs here, courtesy of Jonas from Tennis Nerd, but his weighed 353 grams with a whopping 360 swing weight. So good luck swinging this Head Speed Legend Pro, everybody. Those specs are insane, but I think we can all say that it's pretty darn cool because however heavy it is, it's clearly working for someone. Wait a second, where are the liquid metal ports here? Why is this beam looking all aerodynamic into the throat? I swear this is a 23mm beam, and that's definitely a 100 square inch head. Wait a second. Is this just a Head Speed Pro? Oh. So yeah, cat's out of the bag. This isn't a PT 346.1 weighted up to Djokovic's actual specs. I'm sorry everybody, and I think I can officially say that's never going to happen. The Head Speed Legend was our chance, and the fact that they're not doing it is probably the nail in the coffin, and I think there are a couple of reasons for that. For one, this wouldn't just be an RF97. That racket is tough enough as it is, but Djokovic's racket specs are on a whole other level of difficult. That swing weight is obviously off the charts, but also a 95-18 mainer with such a thin beam and no stabilization tech would be really, really tough to use. Well, I guess the lead is stabilization tech, but that doesn't make it any easier. The other thing is the Origin experience hasn't exactly worked out too well for Babolat. That racket is also ridiculously tough to swing, and I guess not enough players are willing to part with $400 and usability just to play with Nadal's actual racket. So yeah, no Novak racket. This is just a Head Speed Pro 2024 painted to look much, much better. That I don't think anybody can deny, although some people seem to like this. I know everyone's a little bit disappointed, but fear not, that's where I come in. I haven't actually reviewed the new Speed Pro yet, so that's what we're going to do today. I know that's not exactly the best consolation, but hopefully it's enough, and honestly, the Speed Pro is a great racket, so I'm glad we finally have it in a blacked out paint job. There actually is one small but important difference to note between the two rackets. The paint itself on the regular Speed Pro is matte and has this pretty rubbery finish to it, which definitely makes the feel a bit more muted than it could be. I don't know if you can see it on camera, but the finish on the Legend is fully glossy. Now, admittedly, I haven't actually played with the Legend, but from what I can tell you about the difference between a matte and a glossy finish, especially a rubbery matte paint job like this, the Legend should feel less muted. Now, of course, we are talking about very small differences, but that is probably going to make some people very happy, so it is worth noting. We are going to get into some specs here in a second, but before any of that, let me remind you that any of the rackets we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Please remember to follow me and the store on Instagram, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments section what you want me to cover next. Okay, so for the rest of this video, I'm going to put this racket down because this one's so much cooler. Let's talk about some specs, and honestly, they're very similar to the previous version. It still weighs 310 grams, has a 100 square inch head size, 23mm beam, and 18x20 string pattern. So yeah, all those specs are the same. The racket has gotten a little bit softer with this one coming in at 60 RA strung, and the swing weight has gone up by about 5 points. This one was swinging at 336. That's obviously a pretty high swing weight, and when you combine that with the high static weight, the 100 square inch head size, the 23mm beam, it is a pretty hefty racket. So I'm actually going to start this review by talking about who it's made for. I am going to talk about specific playability later, but I did want to start here because it's very important to explain that if you want to get the most out of this racket, you have to be a pretty advanced player and definitely on the stronger side. It's a tough racket to swing, and when I say tough, I mean it feels really, really heavy through the air. I'm going to play two clips here side by side just to show how much quicker my swing speed was with the CX200 I was playtesting last week. As you can see with the Speed Pro, I'm having a much harder time bringing the racket face quickly through contact, and that's something I've been really focusing on doing recently because I get great control from the spin I can produce that way. The best way I can describe the feeling I have when I swing the Speed Pro is that the racket kind of controls me, I don't control the racket. With the CX, because it's so light, I feel like I have full control over the racket face during the swing. With the Speed, I'm swinging it, then letting physics guide the face through contact rather than keeping full control over it with my hand. Now, it's not like I couldn't swing the Speed Pro quickly, but if I wanted to, my timing had to be perfect, my footwork as well, and then finally, if I was perfectly set up for the shot, I had to actively think about swinging hard. But I'm not a great player by any stretch of the imagination. This racket is probably a little bit too much for me to handle, but for any true open level player, you should have the technique and swing speed to handle it. You obviously still need to like a hefty racket, and keep in mind, it's never going to be as quick as lighter weight 100s or even 95s to 98s with similar specs. Really, and this is actually quite ironic, but everything about the Speed Pro screams slow, especially that 23mm beam, which I'm starting to think actually makes this racket more sluggish than the Gravity Pro. The Speed does have a slightly aerodynamically optimized throat, so I think it does accelerate through contact maybe a little bit faster when you swing the racket face parallel to the ground, but for any other type of movement, the Gravity Pro is just faster. So that's just it. If you play with a modern style and you want to swing this racket, you got to be pretty advanced and quite strong if you want to swing it fast. But it's not limited to that type of player. It's also great for players with a slower swing speed who want to tap into some of the Speed Pro's playability. I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit more later, so keep it in mind, but for now we're going to talk about more specific playability. Now, before I get super detailed about spin, power, and control, I want to talk about exactly what the Speed Pro represents. And really, this is the ultimate jack of all trades racket, again, for an advanced player. That gives you a pretty big hint about how this racket performs for spin, power, and control, but the way they all kind of mesh together on this racket is really quite fantastic. I know I've sort of said this about the Speed MP and the Radical, but this is the one that I find really does it all without sacrificing anything, except for, of course, user-friendliness. I think if we're comparing it directly to the Speed MP, it's really on the control side of things that the Pro is so much better. The 1820 string pattern gives it an element of stability and especially consistency that the MP really can't compete with. Of course, that 1820 does take away a bit of spin, and the racket being slower does that as well, but it's still very spin friendly, and I think the Pro is more spin friendly than the MP is controlled, which is why I'm saying it's a little more jack of all tradesy. Now let's unpack the playability a little bit more, because saying the racket is good for power, spin, and control is one thing, but how does it actually achieve that, and how does it compare to other rackets? The first thing that really stuck out to me playing with the Speed Pro after not using it for a while was the power. I've always had this idea in my head when I grab an 1820 that I'm going to have to swing hard to get depth, but you don't really need to do that with the Speed Pro. For one, the string bed itself isn't super tight. It's definitely tighter than your average 1619, but one of the most open 1820s, so you still get some trampoline effect. Then you've got the combination of that really high 336 swing weight with the 23mm beam that makes it a bit of a rocket launcher when you get a hold of the ball. You see, most 1820 control rackets have at maximum a 22mm beam, and they're usually not 100 square inches either. That's why even if you do weight them up, they'll never be able to really launch the ball the way a pure drive can, for example. I'm not saying the Speed Pro has the same power as the pure drive, but it's the most inherently powerful 1820 I've tried, which is really good because put away power on ground strokes and on serves is up there with the best. Now, it did take me a bit of time to dial in that power, and watch this clip. You can see after a slice I look down at my racket and can't believe the depth I got, but just because it is this powerful doesn't mean it's not controlled. Now, control is a funny thing because people usually just think it's perfectly inversely correlated to power, but that's just not the case. I've even gotten some comments saying, how can you say a racket is powerful and controlled? So I'm going to try to explain that a little bit with how the Speed Pro works. The Speed Pro isn't exactly controlled in a way where you can just whack it at the ball as hard as you want and it's so low powered that it'll probably stay in, even if you do make a mistake in your technique. You do have to be a little bit careful with this racket. It's not wild, but it does push the ball far, so if you screw up your angle or your depth, it could end up going out. So it's not like a Prestige in its control, I'm not denying that, but where it's fantastic for control is in its stability, solidity, and consistency that I mentioned earlier. That's really all thanks to the constant beam and especially this 18x20 string pattern. 1820s have this sort of boardiness where the string bed feels kind of dead, so you don't get a random response ever, and they also usually feel very solid. The Speed Pro has that, but it works in tandem with the higher power, so you get a very stable and consistent power a controlled power, if you will. Also, of course, with it being an 1820, the launch angle is noticeably lower than it is on the Speed MP, which also helps with control, especially on flat shots. Now, the launch angle may be lower than the Speed MPs, but it's not very low compared to other 1820s. In fact, I'd probably say it's the highest launching 1820 right now, and that's a major reason for why it can generate so much spin. When a racket has a higher launch angle, you get more purchase over the ball, which is why you can brush up and generate plenty of spin. You could say the racket's more grippy in a way. Also, like I said, the string bed is a little bit more open than your average 1820, so you do get more trampoline effect for power, but also more snapback and string movement for spin. It's probably the most spin-friendly 1820 right now, and even though it does have very good flat control, if you want to get the most out of the Speed Pro, you need to tap into that spin as well. It's when you manage to marry the power, spin, and control all in one shot that you really get in the groove. That's when the racket gives you the best feedback. Now let's circle back real quick to what I said earlier about how you definitely can play with this racket if you have a slower stroke. The reason I said that is because if you play with that slower, old school flat style, you'll at least be benefiting from the Speed Pro's great stability, power, and control. But you won't be unleashing the frame's full potential with that style because you're not really generating spin. Like I said, this racket really shines when you tap into all three, and the only way you can do that is if you're swinging fast with modern technique. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with not unleashing this racket's full potential because I genuinely believe it's one of the best rackets out there for that flatter style, but I'm just talking about what this racket can do. But yeah, that's kind of it with the Speed Pro. It's a super unique racket, and that was always going to happen when they slapped an 1820 on such a thick beam with some spin tech. It really is a great stick. I don't think I could personally ever switch to it, and I definitely prefer the Gravity Pro take on heads version of the 100 square inch 1820. And by the way, if you want to see an in-depth comparison between those two frames, you can click here. I know I'm talking about the old one in that video, but really the idea behind the Speed Pro hasn't changed all that much, so it's still relevant. But anyways, hopefully you're not too disappointed with the Speed Legend Pro being just a paint job. Realistically, no one should swing Novak's racket if they want to be competitive, and at the end of the day, that's what these brands are doing, trying to give us competitive rackets. But yeah, I can't deny that I'm not a little disappointed as well. With that said, that is going to be the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, if you do want to demo the Speed Legend Pro, the Speed Pro, or really any other racket, you can come visit us in store, or you can check them out online at racketsandrunners.ca.